Today, the committee meets to talk about tax policy that helps children and families climb the economic ladder to economic security. There are a lot of policy issues here. In my view, it comes down to one basic proposition. Congress has a proven strategy for lifting millions of American kids out of poverty and ensuring their families have a stronger opportunity to get ahead. So the question really becomes, are you willing to act on it? And in my view, that ought to be an easy call. The reality is, helping more Americans get ahead and encouraging people to work are not mutually exclusive. These are priorities that go hand in hand, and we're going to hear that today. Now, a little bit of recent history. In 2021, as part of the American Rescue Plan, Democrats in Congress passed landmark expansions of significant sources of financial help for low-income families. The child tax credit got the biggest expansion. Previously, it was worth $2,000 per child each year, and lower-income families who needed more help actually got less than higher-income families. After the expansion, the child tax credit gave families $3,600 for each child up to age 5 and $3,000 up to age 17. For the first time, Democrats made it fully refundable. And what that means, that's not Washington word salad. It means the lowest income taxpayers get the full value of the credit. No more discriminating against the most vulnerable people. Democrats also modernized the system to pay out much of the credit in monthly installments rather than all at once during the tax filing season. That gave families a more reliable boost to their monthly take-home pay. The American Rescue Plan also expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit to encourage even more people to work. It boosted the tax credit for child and dependent care. Let's talk for a second about the effect of the expansion. According to researchers at Columbia University, expanding the child tax credit lifted 3.7 million American kids out of poverty. Child hunger fell by nearly a quarter. Other research shows that when families escape poverty, kids are healthier, they do better in school, their earnings are higher as adults. A couple of stories from Oregon. A single mother in Myrtle Creek wrote that she was finally able to save up enough to move her 3 kids out of a rundown apartment into a better home. A single mom in Portland wrote that she was relieved to be able to cover the bills and actually would be in a position to have a little bit of a nice Christmas with the kids. Another mom in Eugene who lives with extended family wrote that she was finally able to save up for a place where she and her son could live on their own. Millions of Americans had stories like this. The fact is, for the first time in a long time, they felt some real financial relief. Unfortunately, these landmark enhancements to the tax code expired at the end of 2021. The Congress hasn't been able to agree on it. In fact, a couple of times, I just went to the floor of the United States Senate and asked unanimous consent to extend it as we go forward with longer-term kind of efforts. We weren't able to get that done, and we are just going to continue to push to keep kids out of poverty and help families get ahead. Today, I especially want to thank my colleagues, Senator Brown and Senator Bennett. They have been real champs, along with Senator Casey, who's also a member of this committee, of tax policy supporting kids and families. Today, they're introducing the Working Families Tax Relief Act, and I'm pleased to be one of your co-sponsors. It would make the 2021 expansions of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit permanent. Today, there are 19 million kids whose families don't get the full child tax credit, and they are disproportionately Black and Latino families. Under the Brown-Bennett proposal, those families would no longer get shortchanged. So their legislation, and I see Senator Casey has arrived, who's also been a great champ of kids. These 3 senators are offering ideas consistently that are pro-family and pro-opportunity. And I very much appreciate that, and I think it ought to be of interest to a lot of senators. Now, sometimes we hear from folks on the other side of the aisle that these kinds of initiatives discourage work. That claim just doesn't get reliable research backing it up. Hundreds of economists have looked into this issue in the last 4 years. The Federal Reserve recently did. The overwhelming majority of experts agree that the child tax credit expansion did not hurt employment in any meaningful way. In fact, in some cases, it actually helped more parents enter the labor force because it helped them pay for essentials like childcare and transportation that are absolutely key to being able to hold a job. July 2021, when the first payments under the expanded child tax credit went out, the unemployment rate was 5.4%. In December of that year, after 6 monthly payments had gone out, the unemployment rate was 3.9%. So it is pretty hard to see how you make a case that the child tax credit is keeping people out of the workforce. It certainly wasn't the case in 2021. And I think there's something of a double standard in the heart of what has been a Republican argument. If the tax system being less generous to low-income Americans encourages work and productivity, why doesn't the same logic apply to the wealthy? The reality is that all Americans want to work hard and provide for families. That's part of what makes our country and our economy dynamic. This Republican double standard that punishes low-income Americans and favors the folks at the top, the wealthy, in the long run, in my view, just limits opportunity, makes it harder for lots of people to get ahead. So I think this is an issue that ought to have bipartisan support for a change that gives everybody in America the chance to get ahead. Lots to discuss today. We look forward to our questions. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we focus on anti-poverty and family support provisions of the tax code. It's important to have a conversation about existing provisions, what has worked in the past, and what more can be done. If there is one message to distill today, it is that if America is serious about reducing poverty and supporting families, work works. Without work, there is no chance society will achieve either aim. Successes here will be grounded in those from the past. In 1996, I joined a bipartisan, bicameral group of colleagues, including some in this room today, in voting to pass the Welfare Reform Bill. In the decades since, this landmark legislation reforms have led to undeniable intergenerational success. One of the welfare reform's key changes was to replace an ineffective cash handout system with one focused on incentivizing work, job training, and self-sufficiency. One of our witnesses, Bruce Meyer, has written extensively about the lessons of welfare reform and parallels for today. Another, Grant Collins, has extensive practical experience with pro-work, anti-poverty interventions. The decisive transformational results of welfare reform speak for themselves, including marked increases in work and earnings for single mothers, almost doubling for some cohorts. Sharp poverty reductions, with consumption poverty declining by more than 70% since 1996 to just 3.7% in 2018. And broad declines in benefit dependence, including a 5-fold reduction in those needing temporary assistance. As President Biden, who as a senator voted in favor of this welfare reform, said at that time, "I think everyone here believes that work should be the premise of our welfare system." Not surprisingly, recent polling from May shows that nearly 2/3 of Americans support work requirements for recipients of government benefits. Welfare reform proves that we can exercise common sense and be compassionate and fiscally responsible all at the same time. These lessons were applied, for example, when Republicans first proposed the child tax credit in the Contract with America, and were retained when they enacted the credit in 1997, expanded it in 2001 and in 2009, and doubled it in the momentous 2017 tax reform bill. In 2017, Republicans also doubled the standard deduction, lowered tax rates for the hundreds of millions of lower and middle income class Americans, and stretched those lower rates further through expanded tax brackets. All of these changes put money back into the pockets of working families. And it is no surprise that after the bill's enactment, Americans' disposable personal income jumped nearly 87% in the first quarter of 2018 over the last quarter of 2017. I look forward to hearing more from today's witnesses on the key lessons learned from these successes in reducing poverty and supporting working families. In recent years, some have seemed to have forgotten what previously worked and have pushed for changes to government assistance that appear to be generous, but in the end will certainly not solve poverty or even just child poverty. The direct costs for these ideas are enormous. Indirectly, data show that they actually become an impediment to intergenerational growth and upward mobility. Just this past February, for example, results of a cash allowance program being piloted in Spain have arrived. The program has already had sizable and adverse employment effects, with aid recipients being 20% less likely to work and families receiving benefits 14% less likely to have any family member working. As another example, in October 2022, the nonpartisan joint JCT evaluated Democrats' partisan temporary changes to the child tax credit, and they reached two critical conclusions. First, they estimated a staggering cost to continue them, more than $1.2 trillion in the budget window, to say nothing of years beyond. Second, they confirmed that the provision disincentivizes work with a dynamic cost, estimating factoring in work and growth that approached $1.4 trillion, more than its headline estimate. Evidence is sometimes warped to manufacture contrary conclusions. But Professor Myers and Mr. Collins will tell us that an honest accounting of the data is clear. Unconditional direct transfer policies simply do not achieve their aim of actually reducing poverty and dependency, even if they are called a tax credit. There are many thoughtful, compassionate, and prudent ideas worth considering to ensure that our social safety net is strong for those who need it the most. What makes the most sense is to undo the good that has what makes no sense is to undo the good that has already been done through harmful policies, whether in the name of equity, morality, or anything else. Progress requires building upon yesterday's gains, not tearing them down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. And I started smiling last night when I realized that we would have a Matsui in the House today. And Amy Matsui is the Director of Income Security and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. She works on a broad range of economic issues where she's an advocate for low and moderate income people. She is also the daughter-in-law of two people who've been very, very special in the Wyden household. The Congresswoman, Doris Matsui, you're the daughter-in-law, I believe, and the late Congressman Bob Matsui. I think some of my colleagues remember. Yes. There has been in public service few advocates for public service that resemble what Bob Matsui has done over the years to advocate for low-income people. He's just been remarkable in what he did for our country as a member of the Ways and Means Committee. We will continue to miss his service, and we so appreciate having Ms. Matsui here today, and it helps us remember the contributions of the late Bob Matsui, recognize what Doris has done in the House, and we're just thrilled to have you. And I think advocating for low-income people just runs in the Matsui DNA, and we thank you for it. Senator Brown's going to introduce our next witness, Melissa Less.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Crapo, and I echo the chair is always kind and generous towards people, and I had great admiration for both Matsuis. I knew Bob intimately working on different parts of trade agreements and just had such respect for him. So thank you. My friend, I was listening to my friend Senator Crapo talk about work, and something in the importance of work, something I wanted to point out is in the first 29 months of the Biden administration, more jobs have been created in this country than any four-year period in American history, four-year presidency term in American history. I think that's important to remember. Thanks for holding today's hearing, and I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to introduce Melissa Lester from Galloway, Ohio. She's here with us to share what the expansion of the child tax credit meant to her and her family a couple of years ago. I would point out that as a graduate of Mansfield Senior High School, she was a graduate of our arch rival, Marion Harding High School, named after one of Ohio's many, many presidents, Warren Harding, who grew up not too far from where she grew up. She's a licensed social worker. She's a public servant. She and her partner live outside Columbus. They have two daughters, Olivia, who's 3, Emma, who is 1. Like so many Americans, Ms. Lester knows firsthand that raising children is work. Our tax code should reflect that. We'll hear from Ms. Lester about her experience as a working mother, all the costs that come with raising children that just keep coming and coming and coming, something she has to look forward to, and we need to help. The expanded child tax credit has helped her family afford the essentials, child care, infant formula, clothes for growing daughters. It gave them the peace of mind when it came to spending a little on gifts for holidays and birthdays. She and her partner both work full-time in addition to the full-time work as parents. Like so many Americans, this hard work doesn't pay off like it should. The end of the expanded child tax credits have made it much harder for them to keep up with the rising cost of living and added to the already immense mental load of raising a family that millions of families face. Her story is the story of so many in our country. It's why bringing back this tax cut, the largest tax cut for working families ever, is so essential. Data shows, as the chairman said, expanded child tax credit meant more money in the pockets of 90% of Ohio families and dramatically reduced poverty. That's why today, as the chairman said, along with Senator Bennett, Senator Wyden, Senator Cortez Masto, Casey Stabenow, all of them are co-sponsors. We're introducing our Working Families Tax Relief Act to make the CTC expansion permanent. Thank you for your willingness, Ms. Lester, to share your story, the real parents behind these numbers, the story of so many families with the committee today. I look forward to working with you, working with this committee. I may have to leave before your testimony, but I will be back to ask questions in about an hour. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to do this.
I thank my colleague, Ms. Lester. You should know that Senator Brown persistently speaks up for the child tax credit, and we're glad he does, and we're glad to have you. We've got our fourth witness will be our next witness will be Bruce Meyer, the McCormick Foundation professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. He's been teaching there since 2004. Fourth witness, Grant Collins, is the president of FedCap, nonprofit group. He leads the group's efforts on workforce development and a variety of employment service contracts, which he is part of through governments in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, as well as UK and Canada. We welcome you. Thanks to all our witnesses. What's customary, that your prepared statements will be automatically put in the record. So if you want to take a few minutes to summarize, and again, Ms. Matsui, seeing you at the witness table, I just remember Bob being on Ways and Means, and I was on Commerce, and he'd just walk up to me and say, here's what we need to do. And I said, tell me what to do. Thank you. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much, Senator, for that warm welcome on behalf of myself and my family. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony will address how refundable tax credits reduce poverty and support families. Refundable tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit have a long track record of boosting families' incomes, thereby narrowing wage disparities, reducing poverty, and supporting family well-being. These credits especially benefit households headed by women, households of color, and families with low incomes, helping to mitigate the harsh economic effects of gender and racial discrimination, stagnant wages, and rising costs for food, housing, and childcare. The additional income provided by these credits improves children's health, educational outcomes, and future earnings. Their benefits are especially important for young children and Black and Latinx children. The American Rescue Plan Act made temporary expansions to the CTC, the EITC for low-paid workers not claiming children, and the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. These expansions helped millions of families put food on the table, keep a roof over their heads, and afford childcare in 2021 and early 2022. For example, families used their advanced CTC payments to buy groceries, catch up on bills, and pay for necessities like rent and clothing for their children. In addition to meeting basic needs, families said they used their payments for things like back-to-school supplies, tutoring or enrichment activities for their children, and saving for emergencies. Many families reported that the payments enabled them to work more hours by allowing them to pay for childcare and transportation costs, reduce their financial stress, and made it easier to budget month to month. Families eligible for the CTC reported that they were less likely to resort to payday loans or selling blood plasma to pay the bills. The CTC in particular dramatically reduced poverty rates for children, especially Black and Latinx children. Child poverty dropped nearly 30% during the months that families received the advance payments. Overall, the 3 expanded credits boosted nearly 9.7 million people out of supplemental poverty measure poverty in 2021, including nearly 2.9 million adult women and over 4.9 million children. In short, the 2021 expansions to the CTC, EITC, and CDCTC worked. They helped families afford the basics, build a financial cushion, and make the decisions that worked best for their families. They improved families' lives in myriad and tangible ways and slashed poverty rates. Notwithstanding these impacts, the ARPA's expansions were allowed to expire in December 2021. The impact on women and families was immediate and severe, with increases in poverty, food insecurity, and families reporting more difficulty meeting their basic expenses in early 2022 and beyond. This reflects the fact that while the recession is officially over, the pandemic laid bare and exacerbated existing inequalities. Moreover, the recovery has been uneven for many women, households of color, and families with low incomes, many of whom are experiencing lingering health and economic effects from the pandemic. The ARPA's expansions to refundable tax credits were a powerful and effective tool to fight poverty and bolster families' finances during the pandemic. But families continue to need expanded refundable tax credits now and going forward because women and families of color continue to face deep inequities in our economy made deeper still by the pandemic. Restoring the American Rescue Plan Act's expansions to the child tax credit, earned income tax credit, and child and dependent care tax credit would help support the children and families who need it the most, which then benefits our communities and our economy as a whole. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Matsui. Ms. Lester.
Thank you for the chance to testify here today. My name is Melissa Lester. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, live in a section called Galloway. I'm the mom of 2 girls, Olivia, 3, and Emma, 1. I'm also a licensed social worker working for the state of Ohio for over 8 years now, and I'm a very proud member of Moms Rising. I'm here to talk about the child tax credit, which was a godsend for my family. Even with two working parents, making ends meet is a real struggle for us. The childcare has long been our biggest expense. The cost is astronomical. Every family I know struggles to pay for childcare. Even before our second child was born, we were paying considerably more for childcare than our mortgage. Today, with 2 little ones, childcare costs us $2,504 per month. Our family's childcare costs more than a 1-year tuition at The Ohio State University, and the cost just keeps rising. I see childcare as a crisis in this country. There are fewer licensed programs. As expensive as our center is, the program isn't everything that I would like. Staff turnover is high, but wait lists and costs at higher rated centers make it impossible to leave. One center told us that it would be 14 months before our second daughter could have a spot there. Moms like me face impossible choices. Do I keep my job and leave my children at a program that isn't all that it could be? Or do I leave the workforce entirely, risking hardships for my family? In 2021, a lot of those problems fell away and life became much more manageable when we were receiving the monthly child tax credit payments for our oldest daughter. The $300 monthly checks were an enormous help. We used it to cover basic needs, and it gave us a little bit of breathing room. Each month, I was able to use the payments to help with various things, like my daughter's second birthday party, holiday gifts, and when we took our first ever family vacation to Kitty Hawk, I was able to use the $300 towards some of those expenses. It helped relieve the constant stress over finances, and it was an amazing relief. We were even able to save a little anticipation of the birth of our second daughter, since much of my maternity leave was unpaid. But then Congress ended those payments for us. They ended when prices began to skyrocket. My family struggled terribly with the formula shortage. It isn't possible to budget when you have to buy whatever formula you can find, whatever the cost. Now, I keep all my first daughter's clothes, toys, furniture for her baby sister to help cut expenses. I fear a very modest vacation is completely out of reach. Even though my family is considered middle class by government standards, growing up, I didn't experience family vacations. I came from a working low middle class family, and I want better for my children. Continuing the expanded child tax credit and the child and dependent care tax credit helped my family so much. The current credit amounts to a few $100s when we spend thousands on care. We need more family-friendly policies. My employer's maternity benefits are grossly inadequate. By the birth of my second daughter, I had long drained all my paid leave, mostly due to COVID-related childcare closures. The first 2 weeks following my delivery, I received no income, and then I received 4 weeks of pay at 70%. The next 6 weeks are unpaid. As we all know, bills don't stop with a birth, they multiply. I'm still making payments for my second delivery a year later. I firmly believe that our failure to adapt family-friendly policies hurts families and hurts our country. The child tax credit expansion was a glimmer of hope. It made moms like me feel like maybe, just maybe, it's possible for things to get better. If the child care tax payments were reinstated, it would be huge for parents. It would give us just a little bit of space in our budget so that we can breathe. Data shows that the expanded tax credit dramatically reduced child poverty. I don't understand why Congress let it end. Certainly, they weren't looking out for families. Hardworking families like mine should matter to all of you. We need family-friendly policies like the expanded child tax credit, affordable quality childcare, and paid leave, and we need them now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lester, and you are certainly introducing the Finance Committee to the human face of what this is all about, and we very much appreciate your testimony. Dr. Meyer.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. While I am testifying for the Republican minority, I am not partisan. My approach is to see what the facts say. I was pleased when President Clinton used my research and when he signed bipartisan legislation to convert a broken welfare system into one that promoted work, reduced poverty, and encouraged two-parent families. Congress is now considering changes that would reverse these reforms. A child tax credit paid to those who do not work is a child allowance, essentially a cash welfare program administered by the IRS, rather than a credit against taxes conditioned on work or paying taxes. Such a credit is likely to reverse past progress on work, poverty, and family formation, and today I will argue that the case for a child allowance has been based on faulty evidence. In my view, the best evidence on the likely effects of proposed tax and benefit changes comes from large, similar historical changes affecting the same group. In the 1990s, we restricted access to cash welfare, made it work-focused, and expanded the EITC and CTC. Research has identified at least 3 significant impacts of these changes. Employment sharply rose in the 90s, while it was relatively stable before and after, as shown in Figure 1 of my testimony. What single mothers could afford in terms of housing, food, clothing, and other goods, their consumption, rose sharply. It rose for low-educated single mothers over time in absolute terms, and relative to more educated women, those without children, and married mothers. Even those with the fewest resources fared better. The decline in poverty for single mothers due to their increased connection to work is one of the most pronounced successes in poverty reduction over the last 50 years. We learned in the 90s that more people could work than many thought possible. Furthermore, the share of children with a single parent stabilized and then started to fall after welfare reform, reversing a more than 30-year trend. While the causal evidence here is not definitive, the time pattern is strongly suggestive. Given the much worse outcomes on average in single-parent families, this may be the biggest issue of the day. By decreasing the return to work by eliminating the CTC work subsidy and providing widely available unconditional cash aid, the proposed replacement of the CTC with a child allowance would discourage work. As I detail in my written testimony, the real level of payments to the non-working would be much greater from a child allowance and would be available to a much larger group of recipients than under the former AFDC program. The change to a child allowance could be expected to reverse most or all of the employment and poverty gains in the 90s. Not everyone should be expected to work, but targeted benefits are the answer. We have 1.9 million people still on TANF, and 8.5 million receiving SSI, and over 41 million receiving the less well-targeted SNAP benefits. I would also like to emphasize that the case for a child allowance has been based on faulty evidence. Much work has pointed to a National Academy of Sciences report that predicted minimal employment effects from the policy change. However, that report omitted the effects on employment and poverty of eliminating the work incentives of the CTC, even though the report concluded that there would be a large employment response from expanding the EITC for the same population. Relying on values of the responsiveness to taxes used by the NASCBO and in academic surveys, I have estimated that the decreased return to work from replacing the CTC with the child allowance would lead about 800,000 single mothers and nearly 1.5 million working parents in total to stop working. Just these corrections would eliminate much of the child allowance poverty reduction. Furthermore, evidence from the COVID era's advanced CTC is not likely to be a reliable guide to long-run effects. The Census Bureau's estimate of poverty reduction is overstated because of the methods used to calculate poverty. The evidence and other changes in well-being is mixed, though on net does show improvements. This result is expected when you spend an additional $100 million a year, but the money is poorly targeted. Such funds might be better spent improving administration of existing programs that performed poorly in the pandemic. I conclude by emphasizing that a child allowance has been oversold. We are in danger of discouraging work as we did with AFTC, which is not a long-run solution to poverty, and we risk encouraging the formation of family units that cannot support their children. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Doctor, thank you. Mr. Collins, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the Senate Finance Committee for inviting me to testify on anti-poverty and family support provisions in the tax code. I lead workforce development for the FedCap Group, a for-impact 501c3 dedicated to improving the economic well-being of those with barriers to work. I wish to offer insights from my current role and my former role as Deputy Director of the Office of Family Assistance, the federal agency that oversees the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. Earlier this year, I appeared before the House Committee on Ways and Means to testify on restoring the work requirement to lift Americans out of poverty. Among my recommendations, I testified that TANF maintenance of effort spending can be more directly tied to strategies that reward work and job retention. Work and wages are critical to families and children and are a step towards reducing intergenerational poverty. Bipartisan welfare reform has been successful in improving incomes and reducing poverty through work. The Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, is one such work-focused incentive designed to assist workers with limited means. Those that work are able to boost their income through the credit. 31 states currently offer a state or local EITC. Added to the federal EITC, state and local credits serve as important tools to further reward work and improve real-life chances for children and parents. A National Institute of Health report in March of 2022 detailed the following. Multiple studies have investigated the impacts of the income supplements like the EITC for family well-being. Higher disbursements from the EITC have been linked to improved child achievement, increased likelihood of college enrollment, positive effects on adults, particularly mothers, physical and mental health, and receipt of the EITC during childhood has sustained positive effects on long-term educational attainment and economic outcomes. The EITC has been associated with increased workforce participation of single mothers. I'd like to share several examples of states that used TANF funds to provide EITC, state EITC. In Louisiana, a strategic collaboration among government agencies following Hurricane Katrina resulted in over $8 million in EITC payments and nearly another $3 million in child tax credits. Our success was due to an intensive and effective EITC campaign aimed at reaching the many displaced residents, some of whom were plunged into poverty due to job and other losses following the hurricane. While at HHS, we continued our state efforts to drive higher uptake rates for those employed to help more enter and sustain work. We supported local efforts like the one in Benton Harbor, Michigan, where locals went door to door to raise awareness about EITC and increased the uptake rate for TANF adults from 48% to 84%. More recently, states have chosen to implement additional credits or tax relief to eligible low-income families during times of extra hardship, such as many working families experience as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In New York State, for example, in 2021, the state enacted a relief package to provide an additional average of $270 per recipient. These efforts were paired with free tax preparation services to ensure that those who were eligible obtained the credits at no additional cost. In my role at the FedCap Group, we have demonstrated that it is possible to remove barriers to employment for people who have not had a clear path, including people with physical or intellectual disabilities, people with mental health or are in recovery from substance use disorders, and people with previous justice system involvement. Over the past decade, we have placed almost 170,000 people in jobs, affording them the dignity that only work provides. When government supports hardworking Americans through the tax code by rewarding work for lower income earners that can help springboard them out of poverty, the individuals, their communities, and our nation benefit. Thank you, Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the Senate Finance Committee for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. And let's get at this issue right out of the gate, that somehow the child tax credit is discouraging work. Because I think encouraging work and giving families an opportunity to get ahead, they're not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. And I really appreciate your coming, Ms. Lester, because you're the face of a lot of families in Columbus, Ohio. And as we've been talking about, some of my Republican colleagues believe, for example, that people would stop working if the expanded child tax credit were to become permanent. That's really one of the key issues in this debate right now. So a couple of questions for you to start us off. When you were receiving monthly child tax credit payments in 2021, did leaving your job because of those payments, did that ever cross your mind?
No, absolutely not. It never crossed my mind. In fact, I would never see that as an option. In 2020, or well, in late 2019, I should say, my partner actually was laid off, and much of 2020 he was unemployed. So in 2021, when we were receiving those payments, his employment to me was still unstable, working, a job not in his field, and then taking a contract job. So to me, I was the person working in the most secure, permanent employment. And with that comes benefits like health care that my children are on. There are other benefits with my employer that cannot be replaced by a few $1,000s. The few $1,000s, of course, helps us make ends meet, helps us pay for childcare to go to work, but it certainly is not going to replace someone's income, in my opinion.
Okay. So let me kind of maybe put a little bit of a finer point on it. You've got 2 kids under 6. So under the bill that I'm pleased to be co-sponsoring with my colleagues, you'd get an additional $7,200 per year. Is that enough money for you to quit your job and still pay all of the bills while managing the expenses of raising a family?
I do not believe so at all. I don't think that would cover much of anything if I just quit my job and we went to a one-income household. No.
I hope my colleagues have kind of picked up on Ms. Lester's, point, because this is right at the heart of the debate. What we want to do is we want to encourage work in this country. Your senator always talks about the dignity of work. At the same time, we want to give people a chance to get ahead. And I think that's what the child tax credit has really been all about. Now, Ms. Matsui, I think it'd be good to transition to you because Ms. Lester has kind of given us an example of what things are like in Columbus, Ohio, and I think that mirrors what a lot of other people have said. But you have done a lot of research, and I think you have an assessment of this, of what the 2021 effort meant in terms of being fully refundable, the extra child tax credit for work, and why full refundability is so important.
Thank you, Senator. With respect, most of the studies that were conducted of the 2021 expanded credits showed no impact on work, no discernible decline in employment. And in fact, that's consistent with findings that a study that the National Women's Law Center, a number of other organizations conducted with researchers from Berkeley through the Ipsos polling firm, where parents said that, in fact, many of them were able to work more hours because they were able to afford childcare and transportation. So the bulk of the research certainly shows that in 2021, there was not an impact on employment. The child tax credit payments did not cause parents to work less.
And given what you found in light of this evidence, it strikes me as not making much sense that you have a tax credit designed to support kids that leaves the lowest income kids out. Do you share that view?
Thank you, Senator. So in fact, as you note, 19 million children right now live in families whose incomes are too low to fully benefit from the child tax credit. Those are families that are disproportionately children of color. So these are children who do not have access to the benefits of the child tax credit, where their family income increases, their families are better able to provide them with food and more nutritious food, and they can have the basics and what they need to support their healthy development and their well-being.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to go to Dr. Meyer and Dr. Collins with the very question that Senator Wyden has just raised, because it seems to me we're having the same debate we had back in 1996 as to whether or not we should have work incentivized in our welfare programs or whether we should just revert to cash payments to those who need assistance. Dr. Meyer and Mr. Collins, what do you say about this argument that the ARPA child tax credit changes had no impact at all on work or reducing poverty, and that we should stop focusing on the need for work in our efforts to try to help those who need the assistance?
Want me to start? Sure. So first, I want to emphasize that I'm in favor of the child tax credit. The current child tax credit incentivizes work. The proposal in Build Back Better and what was implemented in ARPA would discourage work because it would eliminate the existing CTC and replace it essentially with cash welfare paid out by the IRS. So what the evidence from the last year says, which I don't think is that informative because there were so many other policies that were implemented during the pandemic, and because it was temporary, and I don't think it was particularly well understood. I don't think it was even well understood by the authors of the two most well-known studies, I think, looking at the effects of the ARPA changes on work, because they got the timing wrong. The incentives to work changed when the bill was passed, not when the payments actually went out, because it was the elimination of the incentives under the old CTC, or the current one that we now have, that was the change in the return to work, because it's not when you get the payments that matter, it's when the change in the incentive to work happens, because, for example, we know that most people get the payments the following year, but the incentive to work occurs in the tax year where you're incentivized.
Thank you.
So,
Mr. Collins, okay, go ahead. Leave a few moments. Let's leave the rest of the time then for Mr. Collins.
Sure. So I'm just thinking of, all of the reasons why people work. Some of it has to do with money, obviously, but there are many reasons people work. Facing down lower wage jobs, people do it because there are benefits that go beyond that. The employed lifestyle is a better one. There's a brighter future when you're working. You're more employable when you're employed. We've been able to teach that. People who work have higher self-esteems, and they are eligible for a range of transitional benefits, but rewarding that with an earnings boost from something like the EITC can create momentum, and it literally change a generation, and we should build on that.
Well, thank you. And I think just to put a fine point on this discussion, again, a lot of the argument is, well, changing to a cash payment welfare system is not going to stop people from working. It's not going to be a disincentive to work. Like I said, we had this debate back when President Clinton signed the bill that many of us in this room voted for, that did implement this. And then when the child tax credit was created, it incentivized work and was connected to work. The legislation we are now discussing is going to disconnect, again, these efforts at helping those who are in need the most from the work incentives. Could you just, either one of you, just indicate, did not the system work and work wonderfully? The one that President Clinton signed into law, that most of us voted for, and that we have followed in the concept as we established the CTC?
The increases in employment of single mothers during the 90s were historic. We saw about 1.2 million single mothers join the workforce that hadn't been working, and their employment was relatively stable before and after, so it's clear it was the changes in welfare through per ora and the expansions of the EITC that did it.
Thank you.
I thank my colleague. The only thing I'd say, and then we'll go to Senator Stabenow, the Clinton proposal was 30 years ago. And so in 2021, what we saw was very contemporaneous evidence that this doesn't discourage work, and that's why Ms. Lester's answer was.
Mr. Chairman, that was also as a result of the pandemic, and it was an entirely different circumstance.
I believe we're going to have plenty to talk about, but as somebody who participated in both of them, I thought 96 was something that should be tested, and I think 2021 proved to be a big win, and we'll continue to have this debate. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thanks to all of you. This is such an important discussion. What I find interesting, having been involved in these debates over the years, both in the House and the Senate, is that there is a very different view about how to stimulate the economy and create work. And one, which has been talked about and done over and over again, trickle-down economics, tax cuts in the 2000s, two different tax cuts, the $2 trillion Trump tax cut, always going to the wealthy, well-connected at the top, and then we're told, don't worry, we'll stimulate that, and then it will trickle down to everybody else, and people in Michigan are still waiting. I mean, it has never worked. So now we're trying something different under this administration, which is actually investing in people, investing in America, rebuilding America, bringing jobs home. We're seeing 13 million jobs created in less than 2.5 years by investing in people in America, in creating jobs and creating opportunity for people. So to me, it's, you know, we have this debate over and over and over again. In fact, it's starting again because the U.S. House, who was just complaining about deficits and bringing us to the verge of a default for our country, has now put in a new tax bill that, if it would be permanently voted and put into law, would be another $1 trillion in deficits. And so it's always about whatever the problem, a tax cut will solve it. Whatever, but not for everybody, not for the poor, not for working families, not for working moms, only for those at the top, and then we hold our breath and hope that it trickles down. And so I think it's time really to debunk that. And even when we talk about work, of course we all support work. Of course this is about creating opportunity and lifting people up in the middle class. But I also see different ways of looking at it. My friend, Senator Grassley, who has led us on the Agriculture Committee, to say if you're going to get a government payment, a farm payment, you should be actively engaged in the farm. And yet we have Republican colleagues who have not supported that for years and years and years. And so this is really about who we're trying to lift up, in my opinion, and where our priorities are. And so I would just say I'm a proud sponsor of the Working Families Tax Relief Act. I can't imagine how we can argue with the results that in only 1 year we cut child poverty in half, we cut food insecurity by 24%, lifted 3.7 million kids out of poverty. Why in the world wouldn't we want to continue that? And so let me ask a little bit more in terms of questions after sharing my opinion now. But Ms. Matsui, you've talked about what this means to families. Ms. Lester, you've talked about what this means for you. But Ms. Matsui, if you could talk a little bit more about the estimated impacts, if in fact we did permanently reinstate this policy that had such a shockingly positive result for millions of families the year that we did it.
Thank you for the question, Senator. So most estimates for making the expansions to the child tax credit permanent estimate that there would be a reduction in child poverty of up to 40%. And this, as you note, is really extraordinary. The costs of child poverty for our country, for our society, for our economy are astronomical, and finding ways to intervene and prevent children from experiencing this level of poverty and the impacts on their development and education have long-term benefits for ourselves, for our society and our economy at large. So making these investments and, indeed the weight of the studies that have examined this are not showing negative effects on employment, less than 1% of parents from making the credit permanent. And when compared to the long-term, lifelong benefits of boosting children out of poverty, those impacts simply do not counterbalance them.
Thank you. I've heard so many stories from Michigan parents about the benefits of the child tax credit, but the number one thing I've heard over and over again is it helped me pay for child care. So I could either keep my job or I was able to go back to work for my family because I was able to adjust child care. And I thought, when you look at the census data, it shows that about a quarter of families with young children use their child tax credit payments to cover child care. A precondition to work. And since we haven't addressed child care here in Congress in any meaningful way, this is the one way that we have been able to address this. And so just quickly, Ms. Lester, you indicated that was important for you, and would you indicate that this would be significant for you to be able to support your child care costs?
Absolutely. I mean, childcare costs are my family's biggest expense. With 2 children under 6 and childcare right now for this year, we're estimated to spend almost $30,000 of our own dollars on childcare. I think it's really unrealistic for the regular family to sustain that for years and years. This will be the first year, and yeah, I'm definitely concerned of how we'll continue to maintain this. So family-friendly policies do help families to reduce these costs when they don't qualify for any other, state government assistance.
Thank you.
Despite my agreeing with you and Senator Stabenow so much, Ms. Lister, I have to go on to Senator Grassley.
Like Senator Crapo, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Senator Crapo, I want to remind everybody about Republicans' history in support of families and also fighting poverty, and by doing it by rewarding work. Don't forget the Earned Income Tax Credit was signed into law by President Ford. The child tax credit grew out of a Republican 1994 contract with America. It was enacted in 1997 on a bipartisan basis, a Republican Congress and a Democrat president. Since its enactment, Republicans have taken a lead in improving the credit as an anti-poverty tool. In 2001, as then chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, I worked with Republicans and Democrats increasing the credit from $500 to $1,000. Moreover, we made the child tax credit refundable to help offset the burden of payroll taxes on working poor. This made low-income working families eligible to receive a tax refund even if they owed no income tax, even though they paid the payroll tax. In 2017, Republicans again doubled the credit and increased the amount that those who work but pay no income tax can receive a tax refund. In order to benefit, a tax filer would have to earn income of just $2,500. As you earn more, a larger share of the credit becomes refundable, partially offsetting payroll taxes. Keep in mind the child tax credit was enacted on the basis of the 1996 welfare reform that linked federal assistance to work or skill development through education and job training. The child tax credit is complemented welfare reform by providing assistance to parents transitioning from welfare to work. Unfortunately, members of the other party seek to turn a broadly popular, bipartisan, pro-work tax incentive into a government assistance program akin to the old pre-1996 welfare program. Then their proposal eliminates any earned income requirement. It fails to provide any development or educational assistance, which are available to families as alternative work under the 1996 reform law. In other words, their proposals fail to provide tools intended to help struggling parents back on their feet and tackle the root cause of intergenerational poverty. I fully support lending a hand to families in need of support, and that's like I hear a lot of people of both political parties say by providing a hands up, not a handout. So my question goes to Dr. Meyer. Your research suggests Democrats' workless child tax credit proposal would do nothing to reduce deep child poverty. Can you elaborate on what you mean by deep child poverty, and what does work promotion play, or why does it play a very key role in alleviating this deep poverty?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator Grassley. So what we analyzed was the effect of the ARPA child tax credit accounting for the reduction in work using estimates of the responsiveness to work from the Congressional Budget Office, the National Academy of Sciences, and academic surveys. And we found that the reduction in work induced by getting rid of the work incentives that are part of the CTC and replacing it with cash welfare, as you said, would mean that there would be no reduction in the number of people below half the poverty line. That's what is often thought of as deep poverty, and many people are most concerned about the number of people that have income that low.
Mr. Collins, based on your experience, why is work promotion and skill development so important to fight against intergenerational poverty?
Thank you, Senator. As I mentioned before, there are at least 6 reasons that we know, that we teach, that we see happen when people go to work. Work provides a dignity that only work can provide, actually. It's one of the first opportunities where someone outside the home has said, yes, we're going to take a chance on you. So there's a lot of esteem building. It's a better lifestyle. People are more employable, employed, and it teaches the importance of work for young people as well. Rewarding it with a boost in earnings, the momentum created can change a generation. And we've seen those outcomes since the beginning of the TANF program, and they continue to this day. So when you attach the supplement to work, it has a cascading number of benefits that go beyond the cash.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Next is Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate you holding this hearing on anti-poverty and family support provisions in the tax code. I recall very vividly when we were debating the enhanced child tax credits, the predictions that were made on lifting families out of poverty. I remember Senator Bennett going over those numbers with us as to the impact this would have if we enhanced the child tax credits. We then did it, and the numbers paralleled what the predictions were. We accomplished what we wanted to, lift families out of poverty. So I think the case is pretty clear. The impact of reinstating the enhanced child tax credits. I'm proud of what we've done in Maryland, Mr. Chairman. Governor Moore signed into law the Family Prosperity Act in the state of Maryland, recognizing that there was going to be a reduction in the child tax credits here at the national level. The state of Maryland stepped up for its citizens and passed an enhanced child tax credits and earned income tax credits for Marylanders, and that's now the law in our state. Our governor recognized the benefits of these programs on fighting poverty, and I would hope that we would do the same. Ms. Matsui, I want to ask you a question in regards to money being left on the table. I think the most recent survey shows that as much as 20% of those eligible for the earned income tax credit are not seeking the earned income tax credit. What can we do to make sure that those that are entitled to benefits understand that they are entitled to these benefits, have the help they need in order to receive those benefits, and are not priced out of the market because of the cost of obtaining those benefits?
Senator, thank you for that question, and it's a very important point that refundable tax credits like the EITC for eligible families, there is a kind of a cost of accessing them. Families need to file their tax return every year in order to claim those credits. And for families who are intimidated by the tax system, who have language access issues, or kind of simply are confronted with the pile of paperwork that it takes to file one's tax return, many of them would like assistance in doing so. Unfortunately, programs like the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, or VITA, Community Tax Preparation, there's limited funding, there's limited access in communities. So expanding programs like VITA to make sure that low and moderate income families have no-cost expert assistance in filing their tax returns would help boost the number of families who are able to access benefits. And in addition, for those families who use paid tax preparers, if there's regulation of those preparers to make sure that they're correctly preparing those returns, that would also help families who are eligible for the EITC and other tax credits.
And the VITA program traditionally has been supported bipartisan in this committee. It's an area that we need to pay more attention to because it's become more challenging for lower income families to be able to get the benefits that they were otherwise entitled to. I know the chairman strongly agrees with you on paid providers. I do, preparers. I do also. We've now gone several years without the IRS having the authority to do what they should be doing and properly regulating paid preparers. That would certainly help modest income families. And then we have the IRS helping with direct file, which is a pilot that we're looking at today that would perhaps provide some assistance to lower income families to be able to get this. But I just find that we need to be able to find creative ways to help organizations in the community to have the credibility with lower income taxpayers to be able to get the information and services that they need in order to provide the help for people to get the benefits they're entitled to. So I hope that we will look for creative ways working with you in order to do this. Yes, let's deal with paid preparers, let's deal with the VITA program, but let's look at other ways that we can get reliable information out that can be acted on in a cost-efficient way so that taxpayers can get the benefits that they're entitled to, because just too much money's been left on the table. Mr. Chairman, it's sort of an anomaly. Those that are at the highest ends aren't paying their fair share of taxes. Those at the lower end aren't getting their fair share of tax breaks.
DBA, the double standard. No question about it. Next is, let's see, Senator Johnson. Let's see, no, Senator Bennett is next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thanks for popping up out of that.
No, that's all right. I'm so grateful to be next. I can't tell you. I wasn't expecting it, and I'm grateful to have the chance. I just wanted to say a few words about this. First of all, I want to thank my colleague, Senator Brown, for his partnership on this, and the chairman for your partnership with the rest of the Democrats on the committee. I would say, with respect to my Republican colleagues, and I do have a lot of respect for them, I want to say that they have played a role that's been important over the years in the child tax credit and in the earned income tax credit. Something I like about both of these programs is that they don't require you to add an additional bureaucrat to the federal government to administer them. I really like that as a Democrat, and I do think there has been leadership here. I feel like that leadership's come at a very high cost sometimes, which has been the reduction of taxes for the wealthiest people in this country at a time when our income inequality is as great as it's been since the 1920s, when we have a terrible lack of economic mobility. You know, I would rather be funding the child tax credit and funding the earned income tax credit than borrowing money from workers, police officers, firefighters in America, just so we can give another tax cut to the wealthiest people in America who don't need it. I don't think the American people support that. I don't think they want us to do that anymore. And the reason why is that in their lives, it's not 1996 anymore. We have had 50 years of trickle-down economics in this country, in this beautiful and great country of ours. And in this country, that has caused us to have one of the highest rates of income inequality in the industrialized world. That has caused us, the work this committee has done, has caused us to have some of the lowest economic mobility of any industrialized country in the world. And as a former urban school superintendent, has created a tragedy for the United States, which is that 50%, we have almost the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. That's what we're facing, and our parents are having to spend $30,000 just to pay for child care. And Dr. Meyer is living in an imaginary world, in my view, with all respect, where people who are working 2 and 3 jobs in the whose kids are in the Denver public schools, my old district, and somehow they have time to figure out when this committee passes an increase in the child tax credit, and that's going to cause them to stop working months before they get the check. That's not reality. The reality is a world where parents are scraping by every single month. They can't afford the rent in this savage economy. They can't afford to pay for food. They can't afford to pay for child care. It's tragic. They can't afford to work in America because it's so expensive to pay for child care, unlike in other countries in the world, and because their health care isn't predicted. And that's why Sherrod Brown and I did what we did with the child tax credit. And I will say, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add for the record the Irvine study, the Columbia study, the Urban Institute study, just so my colleagues know that Dr. Meyer's position is not the majority position. The majority position is this worked. We showed that America does not have to accept as a permanent state of our economy or a permanent state of our democracy this level of childhood poverty. We should end childhood poverty in America. That's what I believe. Why does the richest country in the world have one of the highest poverty rates in the world? Why do we have an education system, tragic, that doesn't have quality preschool, that doesn't have quality K-12, and higher education is so expensive that education system where colleagues of mine say, well, don't do anything on the child tax credit, let's rely on the education, where that education system's actually reinforcing the income inequality we have. A world where Ms. Lester has to come here and say to this committee, no, I'm not going to make the economically idiotic, irrational decision of giving up my job where I have to pay $30,000 for child care for an additional incremental $300 a month, which lifted 50% of the poor kids out of poverty in this country. And I want to finish, my time is up, but let's talk about the 19 million kids we've left out because we didn't extend this credit. 95% of those families, of that 19 million, the poorest kids in America, are working, are living with a retired relative, are living in a household with somebody who's got a disability, or whose kids are under the age of 2. So what I would beg and say to my colleagues is, let us work together on this. Let's build on the success that we have. Let's accept that the majority of the studies are right, and Dr. Meyer might actually be wrong, because he probably is. And let's commit together to end childhood poverty in America and create an economy that when it grows, finally, as it has not for the last 50 years, but when it grows in America, that it grows for everybody, not just the people at the very top, and that this country can stand for both freedom and for opportunity. That's what we have to do in this country.
We have to move on, in spite of the fact that the chairman of this committee agrees with so much of what Senator Bennett has to say, and that last point is everything. We've got to give everybody in America a chance to get ahead. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for not having a big chart that you can really look at, but I'm going to start here. This goes back to 1940. The data on poverty really starts in 1959 when the poverty rate was 22%. And you can see how precipitously it was dropping because we had strong economic times, right? The red line is out-of-wedlock birth rates. here's the rest of history. So the black line delineates the war on poverty, where we spent, maybe depending whether you want to use inflated dollars, 15 to 25 trillion dollars on the war on poverty. I look at this, and again, the chart, poverty rate's pretty well flatlined, somewhere between 11 and 15%. Out of wedlock birth rates have gone societally excess of 40%. I think two-parent families generally have less likelihood of being in poverty. Ms. Matsui, can you explain this historical trend? And what does this tell you?
So, Senator, one of the things about poverty in America is that it also reflects the lack of societal investments. We don't have a child care system that is available and affordable for most families. We failed to make those investments over time. So we have a fragile child care system. We have child care workers who aren't paid enough. We have families who can't afford.
Again, I'm trying to relate the poverty rates and out of wedlock birth rates, the rise in single parent families. When I grew up, women didn't have to work, and a single working family could support an entire family.
And Senator, with respect, if wages were increased and the supports to allow people to enter the workforce and take care of their families and engage in the paid workforce, that would probably be more prevalent as well.
Dr. Meyer, can you speak to what this chart tells you?
I find it troubling. I think the rise in single-parent families is one of the more problematic trends that we've seen over the last 50 years. I'm encouraged that the share of children living with two parents stabilized in the 90s and has actually risen a bit recently. And I think we're headed in the right direction. I'm concerned that current policy proposals could head us in the wrong direction.
Again, I look at a chart like this, and as regrettable as it is, because we all want to reduce poverty, I would say the war on poverty didn't work. I mean, in general, it certainly didn't work to the extent that we wanted it to. Would you agree with that?
Well, on this issue, I think that much of the war on poverty actually did succeed, but not without costs. Parts of the package were encouraging people to not work and
what about keeping fathers out of the home? Again, this is 60 years worth of history, and I know there have been a lot of changes. The most recent one that we're debating here today. But to what extent do we still have programs that keep fathers out of the home and actually disincentivize two-parent families?
There certainly are marriage penalties in the tax system, and we still do not do all that we could to encourage two-parent families.
So again, I think one of the solutions is we need to encourage two-parent families. We need to incentivize that. In a budget hearing, this is quite honestly years ago off the top of my head. We had somebody in charge of welfare in the state of Pennsylvania. We were talking about the welfare cliff, and I think back then it was something like a single mom could work and make up to $30,000, but then because of reduction in benefits, she would have to actually make more than $65,000 before she would get $1 more in disposable income. I don't think that's a fluke. That happens. Each state is different and every circumstance is different. Can you speak to that in terms of the problem that we've created in terms of these, just not having a decent ramp as we incentivize work, and then there's just no incentive. If you can work hard, you have to make another $30,000, $35,000 before you can put another buck in your pocket.
Well, the current CTC does reduce the disincentives to work. It encourages low-income individuals to work because it increases the benefits increase with additional work. And that would be eliminated under proposals that are being suggested here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Let's see. Senator Thune, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also thank the witnesses for being here today to, as we examine ways in which the tax code can continue benefiting American families. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Republicans enacted in 2017 nearly doubled the standard deduction and reduced tax rates for individuals in every tax bracket. This has not only helped American families keep more of their hard-earned dollars, but also helped businesses grow and raise wages. And ultimately, these provisions, partnered with other changes in the tax code, like expanding the reach of the child's tax credit, helped the unemployment rate fall to a 50-year low and the poverty rate fall to the lowest level ever recorded. So, Professor Meyer, could you just briefly speak to what Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions you believe were the most effective in boosting employment and reducing poverty levels across the nation, whether it be the reduced rates, expanded CTC, or other provisions?
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act certainly incentivized work. There are, by those with low incomes, there are a couple of studies that have looked at the work responsiveness to the work incentives built in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act CTC, and they found substantial responsiveness of employment to the increased return to work that's generated by that tax credit.
So, but again, to the point, if you had to prioritize what's the most effective mechanism in boosting employment and reducing poverty rates, CTC as opposed to the reduction in rates across the board?
Well, the rates are fairly low at the bottom. I think the first bracket is 10%.
Right.
And but the incentives provided by the EITC and the CTC are really substantial. For a parent, a single parent with 2 children, the combined effect of the EITC and CTC is about $9,000. So it essentially converts a $10 an hour job into a $14.50 job. Really quite a big increase in incentive to work. And that has had a substantial effect on inducing people to work and also just increasing incomes at the bottom at the same time as encouraging work.
So let me just follow up on that. Having said that, do you believe there are further changes that could encourage CTC beneficiaries to enter the workforce, given the positive impact it has as an incentive to work?
Well, one thing I might point to is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act increases in the CTC are set to expire in 2025, and I would favor extending those. That is something that would encourage work and transfer income to those at the bottom at the same time.
So in your testimony, you discuss a little bit about the adverse effects that changes to the CTC in the American Rescue Plan seem to have on workforce participation. Could you expand on that analysis and specifically highlight what adverse effects to workforce participation you would expect to see if these changes to CTC that were made through the American Rescue Plan were reinstated?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. If you compare the benefits that someone not working would receive through the combination of the ARPA CTC and SNAP, it exceeds in most states, and states that constitute 63% of the population, what was paid under the old AFDC system plus the food stamps benefits of that era. And that's not including the current TANF benefits, an expanded SSI that we've seen. So the benefits for the non-working would be quite a bit greater on average, really in almost all areas of the country, than we had under the AFDC program that people rejected as discouraging work. So.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. I'd like to ask some of the other panel some questions, too. Perhaps I'll submit those for the record. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Thune. Senator Casey's next.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for this hearing, and I want to start by thanking both Senator Brown, Senator Bennett, and Senator Wyden, our chair, for leading the effort to include in the American Rescue Plan the enhanced version, the much better version, I would argue, of the child tax credit. Would not have happened without their leadership, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to highlight it and to make it real for people. Look, I can just speak from the perspective of Pennsylvania in the context of where we've been as a nation for the last 40 years. In my view, we've had 40 years of most of the time, with very rare exception, with a tax code being rigged over and over again for the wealthiest Americans and the most powerful corporations in the world. And it seems like every time the Congress had a chance to choose families raising children over very wealthy families or large multinational corporations, the Congress has chosen the latter. The only time in a substantial way that the Congress chose to help, through the tax code, families raising children was in the American Rescue Plan. And as Senator Bennett said, it worked. All the evidence shows that. And I'll go through some of that data in a moment. But I think the most compelling testimony for me, as someone who represents a large state, very diverse state, a state that has 67 counties, 48 are rural counties, where the child tax credit substantially, and in some cases disproportionately, benefited those families living in rural communities, with about, on average, $440 a month. When I listened to my constituents, here's what I heard. I met with two mothers in the Lehigh Valley on the eastern border of our state. Two moms, both testifying to me about what the child tax credit meant to them in 2021. In addition to the purchase of food, which we heard over and over again, and all the data shows that, that's what most families are using it for, food and rent and basic necessities. Ms. Lester, you said in your testimony, quote, "We used it to cover basic needs," unquote. That's what I heard in Pennsylvania. But here's another example. Those two mothers I met in the Lehigh Valley said they were able to use a part of the child tax credit they got to enroll their children in school activities they could never afford otherwise. Just imagine what that means in the life of a child. If they can't join a club that would benefit them somewhere down the road, to fulfill their dreams, whether it's athletics or some other school activity. Totally foreclosed if the families can't afford that. But Ms. Lester, you personify what a lot of our constituents have told us. You said, quote, that the child tax credit, quote, was a godsend for my family, unquote. And again, you said that it helped you cover basic needs. It gave us a bit of breathing room, you said. And you went on to say towards the end of your testimony, quote, "It makes moms like me feel like maybe, just maybe, it's possible for things to get better," unquote. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why the hell wouldn't we do this again? If it works so well, on the macro level in terms of reducing child poverty, no action by the Congress in 75 years probably has reduced child poverty more than this one did. Why wouldn't we do it again? And why would, as Senator Bennett challenged us, why do we have to accept the fact that we have a high child poverty rate?
to say the most powerful country in the world can do nothing about that. This is one thing we can do in a very direct, immediate, and substantial way to reduce child poverty. So I'll submit some questions for the record, especially about the other tax credit, Ms. Matsui. When you spoke and testified in your written testimony with regard to not just the child tax credit, which, so we can explain it to people because it gets confusing around here, helps families raise their children. The other tax credit, of course, is the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, which is specifically designed to help families pay for child care itself and other support. But I'll submit questions for the record, Mr. Chairman, but we need to do this again to take action to dramatically reduce child poverty in America. We can do it, and we proved it in 2021. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague, and we're going to recognize the senator from Nevada in just a second, but I just want to take note that Senator Casey, a number of our colleagues have been talking about the issue of tax fairness throughout this morning's discussion. And I just want the record to show that we have, through our investigators, been able to show that in today's tax system, and it is legal, it is possible for billionaires to pay little or no income taxes for years on end. Firefighters, teachers, nurses got to pay with every single paycheck. But a lot of billionaires don't have to, and it certainly is part of the debate we're highlighting today about giving everybody a chance to get ahead in America. Means everybody's going to have to pay their fair share, and paying your fair share is not something that's going to make you less successful, and I appreciate my colleague's point. The senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panelists. I had to step out to attend a briefing, a classified briefing, but I went through the materials, and this is such an important issue, and I thank you, because we need to weed through the truth and the facts and the impacts to our families and those that are misinformation out there. And by the way, I just have to mention, because this is a conversation I have in my state all the time, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are concerned about, and they call it welfare to families when we give them tax credits to try to support and lift up their families and themselves. But when they want to give tax credits to the very wealthy as well as those big corporations, they forget about, it's not corporate welfare then, it's something else. And so this always astounds me when we are actually talking about lifting up our families and pulling children out of poverty and helping one generation to succeed beyond to the next generation, right? Ms. Lesser, it's just what you said. As a young girl, you didn't have the opportunities, and you want to give these opportunities to your family, and you want to be a part of that workforce. And by the way, as a social worker, thank you. We need you. We need social workers and more of you. And I do not think it is inappropriate to help you succeed and help you with your family so you can achieve that next rung, whatever that looks like for you and your family. So let me jump back here, Ms. Matsui. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle compare a fully refundable child tax credit to the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. That was eliminated in 1996. The program was widely believed to have discouraged work, but the comparison to the 2021 CTC rings hollow. The AFDC program was designed in a way such that each dollar you earned in the workforce often directly corresponded to one less dollar in benefits. This was essentially 100% tax rate on working, right? And so can you talk to me, this is simply not the case with the refundable tax credit. And so, Ms. Matsui, do you agree there's a difference between the two? And why is the child tax credit, why is that important? How does this benefit and support so many children and families?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And I think you raised one very important distinction between the AFDC program, which no longer exists, and the child tax credit. And that is, if someone is working and receiving the child tax credit, they don't receive less. So they can continue to work, they can increase their incomes, and increase the family budget and what's available for resources for their family. So to my mind, that's a very important distinction to make. I think the other point just to make is that, using the word welfare when there are clear policy distinctions between the child tax credit and the AFDC program is simply an attempt to kind of demonize the child tax credit and giving families support to raise their children and make sure that children are not experiencing the deleterious effects of poverty.
Thank you. And then let me follow up on this. In 2016, Canada replaced a patchwork of their federal child benefits with a new Canada Child Benefit. It's a flat monthly payment made to families to help with the cost of raising children under 18. A 2021 study of that, the CCB, found no evidence it caused less work among single parents. In fact, many industrialized countries have generous family benefits and higher labor force participation rates than the U.S. So, Ms. Matsui, would you talk a little bit about how common child and family benefits are around the world and what the impact is of those policies on those families?
Thank you for the question, Senator. There are over 100 nations around the world that provide some kind of child benefit, and 23 of those are comprehensive, generous child allowances that are given in large part without regard to parental income. And the evidence has shown that those programs have a significant impact in reducing poverty. The Canada benefit that you mentioned has shown increases also in test scores, in maternal health, and also improvement in physical health outcomes. So the evidence from programs that provide child allowances around the world shows that they do reduce poverty significantly.
Thank you. And then, Ms. Lester, and you've already touched on this, but the child tax credit and the support provided to you and your family, is that incentivizing you to stay home and not work?
No, of course not.
And I kind of find this offensive for so many families and individuals that because they are just seeking assistance, whether it's with childcare or help with that step up in a child tax benefit that, by the way, large corporations get,
Right.
That somehow it is demonizing all families and individuals that, no, they're just taking advantage of the system and they just want to sit home and do nothing and get money from the federal government. Is that true? Do you see that happening in your community or in your family?
I can see that happening in just, societal sphere. Yes, I can see people trying to demonize families wanting family-friendly policies. But as we've discussed, most other industrialized countries have policies that are family-friendly, and because of that, they have better quality life.
Thank you. Thank you again. I know my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My colleague asked very good questions, and one of the areas I would say to my friend from Nevada that we got into that highlights your point is the reason people do want and need to keep working is because of these crushing child care bills. These child care bills and the $30,000 is clearly just devastating to people. Senator Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks for holding this hearing. Thanks to Senators Whitehouse and Cortez Masto Warren and the chair for their work on this and their co-sponsorship of our bill today. I was sitting on the Senate floor with Senator Casey on March 6, 2021, and I remember turning to him and saying, this is the best day of my career because it's the day that we passed the expanded child tax credit, unfortunately on a party line vote by one vote, but we passed it, and what Ms. Lester said in her opening statement and the difference it made in her life was the whole reason that we were all so excited about it and the reason we should renew it. I remember after that day, we passed it March 6th, the president signed it, maybe March 20th, I'm not sure. I remember I called Secretary Yellen the next day and asked her to call the IRS, who was a Trump appointee, but a true public servant. And she called him, I called him. That was in March of 2021. By July, checks had gone out to the families of 60 million children, including Ms. Lester, 2 million, the children of 2 million, the 2 million children of families in Ohio. We know what parents face today, as she said so well in her testimony. Everywhere it seems people are getting squeezed. This tax cut provided a little bit of relief. That's why we're introducing the bill today, again, with Senators Bennett and Wyden and Warren and Whitehouse. Ms. Lester, I want to ask you a question. We've heard a lot about 1996 today, perhaps tiresomely, but let's talk about life for parents in 2023. How did the predictability of knowing that you receive your tax credit every month help give you peace of mind and allow you to plan for your family's budget?
Like I had mentioned, it helps cover costs that come up every month. There's always going to be birthdays, holidays, gifts to buy, parties, children, love parties. There's always that. And then children always need clothes and shoes. I used a lot of that money towards that. I mean, kids grow out of clothes very fast. And in Ohio, is a 4-season state. So at minimum, I have to buy clothes every season. Same thing with shoes every season. And even when you're shopping at places like Target and Walmart, the costs add up very quickly. I would say on average, I spend well over $100, when I just had one child, well over $100 per month just on clothing and shoes alone.
Yeah.
But,
thank you. And I've never heard it's called a 4-season state. I've lived there my entire life, but I know what you mean, and it really is. So thank you for that. I'm glad we got to hear a little more about Olivia and Emma. And you talked about your childhood 30, 40 miles away from where you live now in Marion. And tell us how you think that restarting the expansion would make their lives just a little bit better, which will affect their future lives.
It would help their parents, cover childcare costs and be able to have money for other things, other necessities in life. Right now, that's our entire focus is just on paying childcare, and then everything else is kind of next. And I think if we weren't spending as much money towards childcare in the future, I think, how much help could I help them with college? Because I worked my way through college on my own and was a first-generation college student and the first woman in my family to go to college and also to get a graduate degree. I want that to be possible for them. I want them to go as far as they want to go or even further. And I would like to be able to help them as my family was not able to help me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I've heard today, I've had to be out of this committee. I had to do something on the rail safety issue in Eastern Ohio that you know about in our state. But I've heard it for years, and Chair Wyden's heard it, that this $300 a person, $300 a child if the child's under 6, $250 a child from 6 to 7 to 18, that it makes people lazy, that they'll quit. So let me ask you this question. I mean, it's kind of a stupid question, but it just sort of answers. If Congress decided to restart the CTC expansion, would you quit your job?
No.
Okay. I think if I ask all of the parents of the 2 million children in Ohio that question, it would be such a minuscule number of people say, yeah, I'd quit my job. Because, I mean, parents are working hard. They're working hard with their kids. They're working hard in the workplace. We've seen the rich get richer in this country. We've seen moderate income. I mean, I heard you say maybe middle class for you, working class, but however you think of yourself that way, struggling, working hard, putting a lot of hours in, not getting ahead. This gives people, as I said, there was the proudest day of my career the day we passed that, because I knew enough people. We had not met before today, but I knew enough people in my state and my neighbors and others that it will make their lives easier, better, more productive, and especially give their kids a launch that we don't do well enough in this country. So thank you, and Ms. Matsui, thank you too. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you. We already talked about the Brown Doctrine of the dignity of work, so we appreciate it. Senator Warren, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the tax code is a powerfully important policy tool. It raises the revenue that we need to fund investments in hospitals and bridges and clean air. It determines whether or not the wealthiest must pay their fair share for these investments, and the tax code itself is a social insurance system that helps struggling families. So today I want to talk about 2 ways to make our tax system fairer: restoring the expanded child tax credit, or CTC, and making it easier for families to actually claim that credit. For decades, the CTC has helped families with the cost of raising children. And during the pandemic, as many of my colleagues have talked about, Democrats expanded the CTC to make it more generous and to ensure that the poorest families would get a check from the IRS when the CTC exceeded the amount that they owed in taxes. So, Ms. Lester, I thank you for joining us today. I know you've talked with a lot of people, but I just want to understand, you're an Ohio-based mom, right, with 2 daughters. How old are your girls?
Yes. My oldest is 3.5, Olivia, and then the youngest just turned 1, and her name's Emma.
Ah, great names. What a blessing. Can you just say a word about how the child tax credit has made a difference in their lives?
I received it just for Olivia, but it definitely did help us cover a lot of different costs. Like I had given an example of, I took my first ever family vacation. That helped towards the cost of that. I wanted my daughter to see, the ocean. I'd love her to experience things that I never got to experience growing up. And I think that, travel and experiencing different cultures is part of that to expand her horizons.
That's great. The expanded child tax credit lifted nearly 3 million children out of poverty, and it slashed the child poverty rate almost in half, the largest single-year decline on record. We need to restore the expanded child tax credit and make it available again to mixed-status families. But we also need to make it easier and less expensive for families to file their taxes in order to claim it. So, Ms. Lester, let me ask you, how did you file your taxes, including the claim for the CTC? Did you have to pay money to file your taxes?
Yes, I use like an online software program. It's called TaxAct. It's like TurboTax. I've been using that for well over a decade.
Do you remember what you paid for it?
This past year, yes, I had to pay like about $45 for federal and then $45 for state. I try to file the state myself so that it's free, but something went wrong this year, and so I had to.
Okay, so $90 in order to get your child tax credit. This is all too common. The Tax Act is actually part of a public-private partnership called Free File, which was supposed to allow 70% of taxpayers to file for free, but it in fact only serves about 2% of filers. Instead, the average individual, you're at least below average on this one, the average individual spends about $140 to file their taxes. Now, those prices help the likes of TaxAct and Intuit and these other for-profit outfits, but they are also a big reason that over 10 million low-income Americans don't claim the hundreds of dollars in tax benefits that they are legally entitled to every year, including the CTC and the EITC. Our current tax filing system isn't working, and that is why just last month, the IRS announced that it will be launching a new tool next year that will allow taxpayers to file for free directly with the IRS. Ms. Lester, I want to ask, if the IRS were offering a free tool that you could use easily and securely to file your taxes, would you be interested in using it?
Yes, I would probably feel a little more competent in using their program than a for-profit company. That's the reason why I've stayed with the one for so long is concerns of security.
Yep, good. And of course, save yourself some money there.
Right.
So along with announcing the direct file pilot for next year, the IRS released a report which clearly showed that taxpayers want a direct filing tool and that the IRS is able to provide one. So it's great news that the IRS is acting. Congress needs to step up too. We should restore the expanded CTC and fully fund the IRS so that it can keep providing and improving services like direct file to ensure that American families get the refunds they're owed. That's the kind of tax reform that American families deserve. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to go to Senator Tillis in just a quick second. I want people to note this is a very important exchange between you, Ms. Lester, and Senator Warren. What we have been talking about since 2011, when I introduced Free File with Senator Dan Coates, Republican. This is, again, Ms. Matsui, back, almost in yesteryear. Dan Coates, Republican of Indiana, joined me in it. And the only thing I want to add to the record is what Senator Warren is talking about, and I've been talking about, is a purely voluntary idea. So when we get this done, and we're going to stay at it till we do, it would be presented to you, Ms. Lester, as something, if you chose to, you could do it. No government initiative is going to require you to do anything. And I think your exchange with Senator Warren was very important. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I do want to go back to what I think some of the main drivers were for the child tax credit and the American Rescue Plan. If you remember, we were in the midst of the pandemic. A lot of people were talking about how we needed to provide relief to families. So keep in mind, we had school closures, we had daycare availability, we had a lot of stressors that suddenly made people who were employed think what was going to cost them less. Stay employed or go home and take care of their children. And we were trying to find a way to make the numbers work. The Congress was trying to way to make the numbers work. I voted against the American Rescue Plan and stand by that decision, not purely because of the CTC, because I don't think we're getting this right. Do we need a child tax credit? Yes. How do we go about implementing, or do we need to provide assistance to families with children? Yes. Do we need it through the child tax credit? Questionable in my mind. The child tax credit was temporary in the American Rescue Plan. And it was truly incentivized to keep people to work. Now we're declaring it to be highly successful with about 5 months of data. I mean, would anybody looking at that program now think that we have sufficient information, Dr. Myers, sufficient information to draw a conclusion it's a highly successful program and we should just reauthorize it?
I don't think so. When we looked at welfare reform back in the 90s, there was a huge amount of high-quality research that preceded it. We're not seeing that kind of research effort to investigate the effects of the American Rescue Plan Act.
Yeah. I think fundamentally, and if you disagree, say so, I think everybody, we should have programs that give parents the flexibility they need to raise their children, to develop their work skills, and hopefully be able to get to work. What's wrong with a policy that tries to incent a positive outcome, which is ultimately to be independent of any government assistance? What's wrong with that sort of mindset when we go in and try to figure out what a child tax credit policy should look like, or other government support systems?
I don't think that there's anything wrong with that at all. The problem I see with the replacing the CTC with the child allowance is that it's universal and it's not targeted to those who really need assistance.
Right.
It's just going to everyone.
I'm sure we're going to have more discussions about this as it's set to expire. But the only relevant experience I have in this space is when I was Speaker of the House. Back during the Obama administration, we had a 10.4% unemployment rate in North Carolina, fourth highest in the nation. President Obama offered every state the opportunity to extend unemployment by another 26 weeks. The state of North Carolina, as a result of a decision I made, and the Senate Majority Leader took a pass on $750 million in additional unemployment benefits. We had an unemployment insurance fund that was nearly insolvent. We implemented policies that reduced the forward benefit on people prospectively who got or who were unemployed by 25% to put it in line with the regional average. We reduced the duration to the prevailing rate of unemployment. So if we were in high states of unemployment, you got 13 weeks. If we were in high states or low states, high states, you got more. Now, everybody said that was horrible, it was draconian, it was going to destroy families. The only thing that happened over 6 quarters is we went from 10.4% unemployment to 6.4% unemployment with no measurable increase in social services safety net funding for the state. I, for one, think we got it right. And I, for one, think we should get this right. It's not about whether or not it should exist, it's who should be qualified for it and what expectations should we have for working families with respect to getting on track, to getting a job, and reducing their independence on government. And if we have that discussion, they can count me in. But just the simple, straight-up reauthorization of the CTC, I don't think serves the best interest of the very people that we're trying to help. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Really appreciate it. As we discuss family support provisions in the tax code, it's important to remember there are several provisions in the tax code that may not get mentioned today, but have a substantial impact on working families and the populations we're focusing on here. In fact, just last week, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, Senator Cardin, and I hosted a joint roundtable of the Senate Finance Committee and Small Business Committee to discuss how the tax code's complexity impacts small businesses. Each participant at that roundtable expressed support for restoration of full and immediate expensing under Section 174. This is something I've been advocating for through my American Innovation and Jobs Act with Senator Hassan. What I found striking was the testimony from the small business owner roundtable participants about what they would do with those tax savings. They'd hire more employees, provide additional compensation or bonuses to existing employees. They'd offer educational incentives and scholarships and provide enhanced health care and other benefits. And these employees they were talking about supporting were not highly compensated executives. They were average Americans who were working to provide for their families and support their communities. It was a helpful reminder that supporting our small businesses translates into supporting America's working families. In addition to ensuring we have quality jobs available for working families, we also want to make sure those families have safe and affordable housing near those jobs. I'm proud to work with Senator Cantwell on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act to build upon the successes of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC program. This bill directly supports working families by facilitating the construction of much-needed affordable rental housing stock. Additionally, I'm pleased to be working with Senator Cardin this Congress on the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would use the tax code to promote home rehabilitation and ownership among low and middle income families in distressed neighborhoods. While the tax credit programs we're discussing today are an important component of our tax code support for working families, they're certainly not the end of the story. I encourage my colleagues to support these other legislative initiatives and the great potential they offer for strengthening America's families and future. Professor Meyer, in your written testimony, you point out that the National Academy of Sciences conducted a study that modeled the income and poverty effects of policies similar to the CTC, but when they directly modeled the impacts of replacing the CTC with a child allowance, they failed to incorporate changes in employment, even though they incorporated changes in employment when analyzing other tax credits. Can you please share why you believe employment effects were specifically excluded in the modeling of the child allowance?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The report is quite peculiar. This was a very influential report that the President and much of the research on the effects of the CTC is cited. In the report, it says that you don't need to worry about the return to work when there's an existing CTC, when there isn't an existing CTC. But it then indicates that the calculations done in the report are with the 2015 tax law baseline and then redone with a second set of estimates using a post-TCGA baseline. In neither case, though, does this report incorporate the effect of changing the return to work. It doesn't include this return when it examines expanding the EITC as an option, but never when it is cutting the CTC by replacing it with a child allowance, i.e. CTC for those who don't work. If we were to apply their methods evenly across the tax credits, we would find a larger employment response than in the estimates that we provided that had a very substantial 1.5 million person decline in work from the ARPA CTC.
Well, this seems like certainly an oversight at best, but a weakness in the data, which will need to be remedied. And in the interim, I think we're all going to have to just do our best based on some of the historical analogs we can think of. Based on your understanding of the CTC and the proposed child allowance, do you believe replacing the CTC with an allowance would have an impact on employment?
Yes, substantially. And I do think that the best analog is to look at what happened when we reformed welfare and saw an unprecedented increase in employment following it in the 90s.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am so pleased that we are doing this hearing today and appreciate hearing each of your opening statements and the approach that you bring. There are so many public and private organizations, along with our federal, our state, and our local governments, that are working to help people climb out of poverty and helping them to build sustainable economic success. In Tennessee, at one point, we had done a Tennessee Women's Economic Council to focus on the issues specifically with women and working moms. And we did that because Tennessee is no stranger to the impact of poverty. And in 2021, 14% of the households, which is over 380,000 households, were considered to be at or below the poverty line. And that's the impact it has in our state. And of that number, just under 80,000 of those were female-led households. So thankfully, Tennessee is seeing our numbers trend downward. People are being lifted out of poverty. We are fortunate that companies are choosing to move to Tennessee and they're bringing well-paying jobs. But even with all of this, poverty continues to be a significant issue that we are working toward reducing. And I think it does take our different government entities and our community partners to do a good job of moving this forward. Mr. Meyer, I want to come to you. I appreciated your opening statement, and you're referencing the work you did with President Clinton as you worked on the welfare to work programs. You highlight your and many academics' concerns with eliminating the work requirements for these incentive programs. Specifically, you mentioned that this could lead to a reversal of much of the progress that was made since the 90s under the bipartisan welfare reform. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit more in depth about how unconditional cash transfers impact the long-term economic stability of recipients.
Thank you for the question. We saw with welfare reform, when we moved to a system that rewarded work, that there was a substantial decrease in poverty for single mothers. And unlike the changes in poverty over time for other groups, it was due to increased work. rather than increased government benefits?
Let me ask you also, I had looked at an article you did in 2019, the use and misuse of income data in extreme poverty in the United States. So how can the U.S. government better work with public and private sectors to account for real income and that real valuation to ensure that the funds are being targeted where they are most needed?
So I appreciate that question. It's one of the biggest issues with moving from something like the current system to a system where you're paying benefits to just everyone. In that case, then you don't have the interaction of social services in figuring out what is the best benefit for people, whether it's money or it's job training or it's some kind of...
So having caseworkers that tailor
Yes.
the benefit to the need. Mr. Collins, I'd love to have you weigh in on that.
Sure. I think it's very important that, well, that the committee knows there's a lot of work that's going on the ground right now. That's sort of what my organization does. We have basically a 7-point strategy for when individuals come in through case management. We ask them what type of job they want. We look at their family size. We do an EITC calculation right up front that spurs their ability to think about what that job looks like. We have basically a 7-point strategy, so we'll talk to you about that job choice at the next meeting. And many programs these days support people through work through 365 days. So we will have that conversation at 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, 365 days. And most importantly, we will invite them in for a free tax preparation opportunity during tax season. And it takes all of that to make sure that everybody who's eligible actually receives the credits they're due for their work.
That's excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Senator Carper's next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, one and all. I had a chance to meet you. I had to run off and chairing another hearing, but I'm glad you're still here, and thank you for your testimony today. I have a couple of questions. One deals with targeting the child tax credit to help those most in need, and I'll just get right to that one. One important principle that I try to follow when considering policies like the child tax credit is to ensure that benefits are targeted to those most in need. I think that's a view that's shared by most, if not all, of my colleagues. Unfortunately, the child tax credit as it currently exists does not reflect this principle. And today, I'm told a married couple earning up to $400,000 per year is able to receive the full benefit of the child tax credit. At the same time, a married couple at the lowest end of the income spectrum is only eligible for a portion of that credit. Question, and this would be for Ms. Matsui and Ms. Lester, but how can policymakers better target the child tax credit to support those most in need instead of benefiting upper income families, all while reducing the cost of the credit to the federal government? Please, Ms. Matsui.
Senator, thank you for the question. I think one of the most important ways to make the child tax credit accessible to those who need it the most is to remove the earned income requirement, which limits and boxes out, at this moment, 19 million children under the age of 17 in households who don't earn enough to be able to claim the full credit. In addition, the provision from the 2017 tax law that made children with ITINs ineligible to be claimed for the child tax credit is another policy that locks families out of the benefits of the child tax credit, and is another way that we could improve it so that the families most in need receive it.
Okay, good, thank you. Ms. Lester, the same question. How can policymakers like us better target the child tax credit to support those most in need instead of benefiting, in no small part, upper income families, all while reducing the cost of the credit to the federal government?
I think you basically have to spend money to save money sometimes, and that is going to be through the family-friendly policies is going to help the average family, such as myself, a two-income working household. We need better policies to be able to continue to work. It's not sustainable to continue to pay almost $30,000 for childcare so that I can go to work. I mean, that's most people's yearly income, so they can't maintain that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
My second question is for Mr. Collins. Good morning. Good afternoon. It's been a full day so far. But a question, if I could, on the Earned Income Tax Credit and workforce participation. As I travel around the little state of Delaware, about 100 miles from north to south, about 50 miles from east to west, we've got 1 million people. But I regularly do what we call customer calls. I visit businesses large and small. We visited schools, hospitals, all kinds of entities, nonprofits. But when I do these customer calls throughout our state, I find out how they're doing. I ask those folks that we're visiting, I say, how are we doing as a congressional delegation? Congress, how are we doing? How's the federal government doing? How's the state government doing? And I ask, how can we help? I ask, what can you help? And common refrain that I hear from many employers is that they're struggling to find workers, people who will come to work, show up regularly, do a job, be trained, and make a contribution. And while we're fortunate to have a low unemployment rate, I think it's hovering around 3.5%. We've got good news today on the inflation side, which continues to subside. I think we're looking now at an annual rate of down to about 4%. We have 340,000 new jobs were created last month. The unemployment rate is still, I think, about the lowest it's been in a long time. But we still have a tough time encouraging people to enter the workforce following the pandemic. Fortunately, the Earned Income Tax Credit is a proven bipartisan tool to tackle this challenge and bring people back into the workforce. My question for you, Mr. Collins, is how does the EITC incentivize people to work, and how can greater workforce participation uplift families and communities?
Thank you, Senator. How does it incentivize? Long research and history has proven that it's done that since the mid-90s. Attaching it to work has actually worked out very well. So work, in fact, does work when it comes to the EITC. To expand it, I think in the situation that you just mentioned in Delaware, it would be very interesting to see if employers would embrace actually doing EITC awareness campaigns so that they can find more individuals that would be interested in working at their particular facilities. This has worked in some of the programs that we've done across the country and some of the actual programs done by the Office of Family Assistance, for example, in Waco, Texas.
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, this may already have come up, but you and I served, Mr. Chairman, with Bob Matsui and later on with his widow. And I know we have here with us today their daughter-in-law. And I had a chance to meet with her earlier, but to just convey our best to your mother-in-law and your family. We appreciate very much having known them and served with them.
The bouquets have been flowing to Ms. Matsui because we all have so appreciated the family's advocacy, particularly for low-income folks and the issues that we're talking about. That's what Bob championed during his service. Okay. Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to have voted for the American Rescue Plan, which provided a historic increase to the child tax credit. By boosting the credit to $3,600 for infants and toddlers and $3,000 for children, and paying those credits on a monthly basis, child poverty decreased by 30% in 2021. In the same year, food insecurity decreased by 24%, the equivalent to 2 million fewer children going hungry. For parents with a newborn at home and a toddler in daycare, that was $600 a month that helped pay for diapers, for baby formula, for child care, and for children between 6 and 17 years of age, the $250 monthly payment went towards new clothes, maybe a laptop for school, the money needed to join an extracurricular activity. Unfortunately, This critical lifeline ended for hardworking families across the nation at the end of 2021. So, Ms. Lester, can you talk about how the enhanced child tax credit impacted your day-to-day life and what's changed since its expiration?
Yes, thank you. As I've said before, it helped us pay for basic needs monthly that come up. Bills come up monthly, not just once a year. We pay for clothes, shoes. We've paid for extracurricular activities as well. Since it's gone, and now I have a second child, our expenses have just, doubled. And, with less help that we can, count on, that has caused me to, run through savings and kind of, running out of resources. And that's why, after this year, I do wonder how we'll continue on at this kind of rate of continuing to pay the astronomical child care bill that we have with the little assistance that we get. Because right now, with the child dependent care tax credit, we hardly receive anything. I think it just amounts to literally a few dollars for us. And, I wasn't aware of that before I had children. I believed that there was, tax incentives for people that self-paid for, daycare, that there was a little more help than there is in reality. And the expanded one from 2021, we qualified for. And that particular year when we filed for it, I believe that was the only refund we had received was from that credit, or, we would have received nothing or would have possibly owed.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's stay on child care for a moment. And child care is about being able to be free to go to work. We talk about the ability to work. Child care is a big part of that, as well as formation of the child. The child independent care tax credit is, I think, critical in making child care more accessible for working and middle-class families. The American Rescue Plan took the long overdue step in boosting the credit from $3,000 to $8,000, but that was only temporary. So, Ms. Matsui, what are the economic benefits that families and the economy stand to gain if the federal government made critical investments in child care?
Thank you for the question, Senator. As you're well aware, child care is incredibly important to sustain the employment of keeping women in the paid workforce, for supporting families, and also to help child care workers who are among some of the most poorly paid workers in our country, but do this essential work. The way that the American Rescue Plan Act expanded the child independent care tax credit, primarily by making it refundable, made that credit available to low and moderate income families, because under current law, families who don't have sufficient tax liability can't get any benefit from it at all. It's only a non-refundable credit that wipes away tax liability, and so only a very small fraction of its benefits go to low and moderate income families. So especially, and as you noted, the size of the credit doesn't come close to matching the costs of childcare that families are experiencing every month. So, if the child independent care tax credits expansions were restored, along with kind of the robust systemic investments in childcare to make the system stronger and support providers, childcare workers, and families overall, it would make it easier for parents to go to work. It would make the workforce more stable for employers, and that would boost our economic growth overall.
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of my colleagues talking about the value of work and rewarding work. Well, you've got to be able to get to work, and child care is an important part of that. One last question, if I may. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 added nearly $2 trillion to the annual deficit over 10 years. But one of the cruelest provisions in the law was excluding the child tax credit for certain tax-paying families because of their immigration status. Isn't the theory, Ms. Matsui, behind the child tax credit applicable to both I-10 filers and filers with a Social Security number. Basically, that proposition being that taxpayers should be able, and I underline taxpayers, should be able to keep a portion of the potential taxes owed and use that money on their children.
Senator, I agree completely with you. Children with ITINs need support in the same way that children with Social Security numbers do. The benefits of the child tax credit are denied to a significant number of children just because of that tax number status, and many of them are dreamers. So I think that having the child tax credit be able to be claimed for children with ITINs is an important equity issue, it's an important economic issue, and it addresses the needs of children so that all of us have access to supports and the ability to succeed in our economy.
Well, I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, we're talking about families who are paying taxes to the federal government. And we will never be able to fully solve the issue of child poverty until ITIN filers have also the ability to access this essential tax credit. So I appreciate you holding this hearing.
The gentleman's point are spot on, and I share his view. All right, I thank our panel. It has been a long morning, just a couple of thoughts. I think, in a sense, going 2.5 hours in, we've kind of come full circle. You know, Ms. Lester, you highlighted it. Encouraging work and helping families get ahead. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can do both, and you just drove that point home and gave us firsthand experience about it. I also want to put this tax fairness issue in some context, and I've talked to my colleagues about this, often. Many people who receive the child tax credit pay federal taxes with every paycheck. What we have also learned in recent years is that it is possible for billionaires to pay little or no taxes for years on end by, in effect, calling in their accountant and saying, just make sure I don't get any income this year. I'll live off my borrowings, this year. I don't want to pay taxes this year. So if ever there was a double standard as we walk out of this room, I think that little snapshot really highlights it. I've introduced a proposal to do that. The president has as well. You all have given us more reasons to take it up, and it also comes in the context of another point that was important today, which is 19 million children are in families ineligible for the full child tax credit, and I think Ms. Matsui and others have made that point. The Brown-Bennett bill would fix that while expanding incentives to work with the earned income tax credit. So there's a lot to do here, and I was also very glad, Ms. Lester, for the discussion about Free File, because, for the life of me, when you look all over the Western industrialized world, their governments do what I just described in your conversation with Senator Warren. They just say, look, this can be a voluntary thing, but if you want us to do it, particularly for wage earners, you and teachers and firefighters and nurses, the government's pretty much got your information. So I think we got to join the rest of the Western industrialized world. The immediate work of business, and I'm glad to be part of it, is to support the Brown-Bennett bill that's going to give families a little bit of a fair shake in the days ahead when they're dealing with those crushing child care costs that you were talking about, Ms. Lester. And I thank Senator Crapo. We're going to look at these issues, see where the possibilities are for bringing the committee together, and you all have helped us get firsthand information. And with that, the Finance Committee will be adjourned.